So, let's dig into a really big question today. What did the Apostle Paul, the man who wrote a huge chunk of the New Testament, actually teach about the final punishment for sin? You might be surprised to find that what he says really challenges a very common, very old idea. Let's get right into it. I mean, think about it. When you hear the word hell, you probably picture a place of endless, conscious torment, right? But what if I told you that that entire idea is pretty much missing from the writings of the Bible's most influential author? And that's exactly what we're going to explore by going straight to the source, Paul's own words. So, our starting point has to be this really bold claim from Paul himself. He said that he never hesitated to declare the whole counsel of God. Now, that's a huge statement. It basically means that if a doctrine was essential, if it was something we absolutely needed to know, he taught it. He wouldn't have left out something so important. So let's take him at his word and see what he actually revealed in his letters. And this leads us to our first piece of evidence, which, funny enough, is actually a lack of evidence. We're going to start with what Paul didn't say, and trust me, it's a silence that's so loud it's startling. Get this, the Greek word most associated with a fiery hell is Gehenna. It was a real place, by the way, the city dump outside Jerusalem where trash was constantly being burned. A really powerful picture of total destruction. So how many times did Paul, the great apostle, use this word to warn people about their eternal fate? Exactly 0. Not one time. Okay, well, what about Hades? That's the word for the grave, or the realm of the dead. Paul only uses it once, and the context is everything here. He's not describing some future place of torment. He's actually quoting an Old Testament prophet in this amazing, triumphant shout of victory over death. "O death, where is thy sting? O Hades, where is thy victory?" For Paul, Hades isn't a threat to be afraid of. It's an enemy that's already been beaten. So you really have to ask yourself, right? If endless suffering was the ultimate, terrifying consequence of sin, the number one reason to get saved, how could the apostle to the Gentiles, the guy whose job it was to explain all this to the rest of the world, just leave it out? The silence here is absolutely deafening. So if Paul didn't use the usual language of torment, what words did he use? This brings us to our next point. We're shifting from what's missing to the very specific and really consistent vocabulary that Paul deliberately chose when talking about final judgment. And this slide just lays out the contrast so clearly. On the one hand, you have the traditional ideas, endless suffering, conscious torment. But on the other hand, you have Paul's actual words, words like destruction, death, perish. See the pattern? These words don't describe something that goes on and on forever. They describe a final, definitive end. Now, this is a point where we have to pay really close attention to the language. Paul does warn of everlasting destruction. But what does that actually mean? It doesn't mean an endless process of being destroyed forever and ever. It means a permanent result. The destruction is everlasting because it's final, it's irreversible. It's a complete end to existence, not an eternal experience of being destroyed. This all brings us to the absolute heart of the matter. We need to look at Paul's single most direct, most famous statement on this whole topic and really understand what he meant when he wrote it. Here it is. Paul's clearest, most straightforward statement on the subject, from Romans chapter 6, the wages of sin is death. You know, given his consistent use of words that mean an end, and his total silence on torment, the simplest reading here is also the most powerful one. He meant exactly what he said. He didn't use a metaphor for suffering, he used a literal word, death, for a literal outcome, the cessation of life. And to really get this, it helps to understand what the Bible even means by sin. The original Greek word literally means to miss the mark. Think of an archer whose arrow falls short of the target. It's not some big, aggressive, evil force out there. It's presented as a failure, a shortcoming, a falling short of God's perfect standard. And Paul connects this idea directly to our own mortality. In Romans 5, he explains that death entered the world through Adam. He says that death is the very atmosphere, the very realm where sin rules. See, because we are mortal, because we are in a dying process, we are cut off from the source of life. And this state of being cut off, this lack of life, is what causes us to miss the mark. Our mortality itself is the condition that makes us sinners.
So understanding all this completely reshapes how we view divine judgment. Is God's justice about infinite punishment, or is it about something far more purposeful, something corrective?
You know, the whole idea of endless, conscious torment creates a huge logical and theological problem. It suggests an infinite punishment for sins that were committed in a finite lifetime. That just doesn't seem to add up. It really challenges the very character of God as revealed in the Scriptures, a God of perfect justice and a God who is love. But the Scriptures actually paint a very different picture of judgment. It's not presented as vindictive torture. It's a corrective process. It's about setting things right, exposing truth, and preparing the entire creation for an ultimate reconciliation. It's a means to an end, not the end itself. And that brings us to that famous and often misunderstood image, the lake of fire. But guess what? The book of Revelation doesn't leave us guessing what it means. It straight up defines it for us. It says, this is the second death. It's not a second life of torment. It's the absolute final fulfillment of what Paul taught all along. The wages of sin is death. It's oblivion, where consciousness, pain, and existence itself simply come to an end. Okay, so if judgment and even this second death aren't the end of the story, then what is? Well, Paul's vision extends way beyond that to a truly breathtaking finale, the ultimate goal of God's entire plan for all of creation. This timeline really helps put it all in perspective. You see earthly life, then death, then judgment, and even the second death. But look what comes after. Paul sees all of these things not as the final destination, but as temporary phases, as steps leading toward one glorious ultimate goal, the consummation. And this is the grand finale. In 1 Corinthians 15, Paul tells us that at the consummation, the very last enemy, death itself, is totally wiped out, abolished, all are made alive. All the temporary pain of judgment leads to an eternal gain so that God can finally be all in all. See, Paul didn't teach eternal torment because he knew how the story ends, with a total, complete victory for God. Wow. So that's the big, cosmic picture. But what does this magnificent vision of God's sovereign plan mean for us, for believers, in our daily lives, right here and now? Let's bring this home with a practical conclusion. You see, for the believer, salvation isn't just about being rescued from something bad in the future. It's about being brought to a state of completeness in Christ right now. Our confidence isn't in ourselves, but in the unshakable fact of God's total victory. We are totally secure in a sovereign grace that is so powerful, it will eventually wipe out all opposition, including sin and death itself. Paul puts it so beautifully when he contrasts the reign of sin with something far more powerful. He paints this amazing picture of grace as a reigning king, a king whose rule doesn't lead to death but to righteousness and life. Grace isn't just a nice idea, it's a sovereign, conquering reality. So we'll end with this question for you to think about. How does this vision of God's complete and total victory over all sin and death, not just managing it, but completely abolishing it, how does that change the way we see his character? How does it deepen our understanding of a love that truly never fails and a justice that genuinely sets everything right?